Hey everyone, welcome back. Get ready because today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that's both fascinating and, let's be honest, sometimes a bit controversial.
hmm
The Islamic view of family. And specifically, we'll be focusing on the roles and rights of women.
It's a rich topic.
It really is, and we've got a great mix of sources to help us explore it. Scholarly articles, historical analyses, and we've even got some Islamic legal texts in the mix.
Yeah, those legal texts can be really insightful.
Totally. So what are we hoping to uncover today? Well, we want to understand how Islam shapes family structure, the rights and responsibilities women hold within that structure, and how these ideas have played out throughout history.
And how they continue to evolve today.
Exactly. I think listeners might be surprised to learn about some seriously progressive legal rights that women held in Islamic societies even centuries ago. For example, did you know about Fatima al-Fihiyya back in the 9th century?
I'm familiar, but for those who aren't.
She founded the world's oldest university. Seriously, we'll definitely be talking about her later. But first, I think it's important to set the stage. To really grasp how Islam approached these issues, we need to understand what life was like before its arrival, right?
Absolutely. Pre-Islamic Arabia provides a stark contrast.
Okay, so paint a picture for us. What was the status of women like back then?
Well, imagine a society where women were largely excluded from inheriting property.
Really?
Yeah. And they had almost no say in who they married, their legal protections were extremely limited, and their voices were often silenced.
Wow, that sounds incredibly restrictive.
It was a very different world.
So the arrival of Islam must have been a game changer for women, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It wasn't just a tweak to the existing system. Islam redefined the position of women in society.
So where do we see this shift reflected?
Well, both the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam, and the Hadith, which are the sayings and traditions of Prophet Muhammad, emphasize the inherent dignity and equality of men and women in the eyes of God.
That's a huge shift. So how did this new perspective manifest in the family structure?
One of the most important institutions in Islam is marriage.
Right, it's central.
It's not just a romantic union, though. It's a formal
A
contract.
binding agreement.
Exactly. And it's considered essential for the preservation of humanity.
And women have some significant rights within this marriage contract, right?
Absolutely. One of the key elements is free will and consent from both parties. A woman cannot be forced into marriage.
Her consent is essential.
Absolutely. And once married, she has rights like the right to a dowry, which is hers to keep and manage.
Wow, that's a big one.
Yeah, and she even has the right to retain her family name, which, is uncommon in many cultures even today.
It's true. These rights really demonstrate how Islam recognized a woman's individual identity and her economic rights within a marriage. It's a far cry from that pre-Islamic era we were talking about. But, we have to address the elephant in the room. There are some aspects of Islamic family law that tend to be controversial, like polygamy and divorce. How do our sources handle these topics?
Well, let's start with polygamy. The Quran does allow it,
It does.
but only under very specific circumstances.
With a strong
Emphasis on justice and equal treatment of all wives.
So there are a lot of conditions and caveats.
Right. And it's important to remember that even within Islamic scholarship, there are diverse interpretations and opinions on this matter.
It's not as simple as some people might think.
No, not at all.
And what about divorce? How's that viewed in Islam?
It's generally considered a last resort, definitely not something to be entered into lightly.
Okay. But it is allowed.
It is, and what's interesting is that Islamic law actually provides avenues for divorce for both men and women.
So it's not just the man who can initiate it.
Right, and there are specific rights and considerations for the woman, like the right to stipulate conditions for divorce in that initial marriage contract.
Fascinating. So there's a lot of emphasis on fairness and ensuring women have legal protections within marriage. But what about beyond marriage? What are the broader roles women play in family and society?
Family is incredibly important in Islam,
I'd imagine so.
and motherhood is considered a highly esteemed position. There are tons of hadiths praising the virtues of mothers and emphasizing how crucial they are to building a strong moral society.
So there's a lot of respect for mothers.
Absolutely.
And what about education? Is that considered important for women as well?
Yes, definitely. Prophet Muhammad himself emphasized that seeking knowledge is an obligation for all Muslims, regardless of gender.
So there's no distinction between boys and girls?
Not in that sense, and there are so many historical examples of women in Islamic scholarship.
Like Fatima al-Fihiyya.
Exactly. These women challenge those stereotypes about women's roles in Islamic societies. Her story's amazing.
It really is. Founding a university back in the 9th century, it makes you think about the social and political conditions that must have existed to allow a woman to achieve such a feat.
It's pretty remarkable.
Now, I know some listeners might be thinking, wait a minute, what about obedience to husbands? Doesn't that clash with all this talk of rights and equality?
It's a question that comes up a lot.
It's understandable. How do we reconcile these ideas?
Well, the idea of obedience in an Islamic marriage needs to be understood within the context of mutual respect and partnership. It's not about blind submission.
Okay, so there's nuance there.
Definitely. Think of it more like recognizing the husband's role as head of the household. It's a concept you see in various faith traditions.
That makes sense.
But, and this is important, the Quran is very clear about the importance of kindness and just treatment of women. There's absolutely no room for abuse or oppression.
So it's not about giving men a free pass to mistreat their wives?
Absolutely not.
Another topic that often comes up is the hijab. This Islamic concept of modesty and dress and behavior. It often sparks a lot of debate.
It does. There are so many different interpretations and perspectives.
Right? Some see it as a symbol of oppression, while others see it as a personal choice, an act of faith, even empowerment.
And you see this range of views within the Muslim community itself.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Definitely not.
Interpretations and practices can vary widely across different cultures and time periods.
It's all about understanding those nuances.
Well, I think that's a good place to pause for now.
Yeah, we've covered a lot.
We've just scratched the surface, really. There's so much more to unpack. But I think you've given our listeners plenty to think about already.
I hope so.
And we're back for part 2 of our deep dive into the Islamic view of family. Last time we were talking about how diverse the experiences of Muslim women really are. And I think it's clear that we need to move beyond those simple stereotypes, right?
You're absolutely right. As we dig deeper into the sources you provided, it really highlights how dynamic this whole topic is. It's not about these fixed, unchanging interpretations. It's about understanding the principles of Islam and then figuring out how to apply them to the challenges we face in modern life.
Okay, so how do we even begin to understand this idea of Islamic teachings evolving over time? Sounds a bit tricky.
Well, think of it this way. Even centuries ago, Islamic scholars recognized that, societies change, new issues pop up. So they developed this really interesting concept called ijtihad, which basically means independent reasoning, but within that Islamic framework.
So it's like they built in this mechanism, this way of adapting to new realities, right?
Exactly. And you can see this reflected today in all those ongoing debates surrounding things like women's participation in politics, education, and the workforce. It's not about just discarding traditions that is centuries old, but it's about understanding the principles behind them and applying them in a way that actually makes sense for the world we live in now.
I like that. So it's not throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
That's a good way to put it.
But it does mean we have to be, more critical about what we hear and what we read about Islam, right?
Yeah, for sure. All those sensationalized headlines and sound bites rarely capture the nuance and the complexity of all of these issues. So instead of getting caught up in that noise, focus on understanding the different interpretations out there. And most importantly, listen to the diverse experiences of Muslim women themselves. I mean, their voices are essential to this conversation.
Okay, that makes sense. So as we learn more about the Islamic view of family, what other kind of insights can we gain from the sources we've got? What stands out?
Well, one of the things that really struck me was just how much emphasis Islam puts on justice and consultation, even within the family structure. And that really suggests, this framework for navigating change and evolving social norms.
I see what you mean. So it's not like this rigid, unchanging set of rules. There's a built-in kind of flexibility, like a way to adapt to different contexts.
Exactly. And it highlights how important it is to engage with these issues in a thoughtful way, rather than resorting to those simplistic stereotypes we were talking about earlier.
Okay, so we've got to look beyond the surface, dig a little deeper into the principles that are at play.
That's it. For instance, while Islam does provide guidelines for family and gender roles, it also acknowledges that humans aren't perfect, right?
We're going to mess up.
We make mistakes. Societies can stray from those ideals. So there's this idea that individuals actually have a responsibility to speak out against injustice, even within their own families or communities.
It sounds like a call to action, like a reminder that we're not just passive recipients of tradition. We actually have a role to play in shaping it.
I think that's a great way to look at it.
But, let's be realistic for a second. Our sources also point to some very real challenges that women face in some Muslim-majority societies. I mean, things like domestic violence, honor killings, restrictions on education, and freedom of movement. Those are some pretty harsh realities that we can't just ignore.
You're absolutely right. These are tragic situations, and we can't shy away from talking about them. However, it's equally crucial to avoid those sweeping generalizations that sometimes happen. To say that all Muslim women are oppressed or that Islam itself is inherently misogynistic, it's just plain wrong, and it ignores the immense diversity within the Muslim world.
So how do we reconcile these two realities? Because on the one hand, we see these principles of justice and equality in the teachings of Islam. But on the other, we see these really heartbreaking examples of women's rights being violated. How do we make sense of that?
It's about recognizing that there's a difference between cultural practices that might have become entwined with religious interpretations over time versus those core principles of Islam itself. It's like separating the signal from all that extra noise.
I see, yeah. And in that process, whose voices are the most important to listen to?
Well, think about it. It's Muslim women who are leading the charge in challenging harmful practices, advocating for their rights, and redefining what it means to be a Muslim woman in the 21st century. Their perspectives are absolutely essential to this whole conversation.
It makes me think that this conversation about faith, culture, and gender roles isn't limited to just Islam. We're seeing similar debates and tensions playing out in different faiths and in different societies all over the world.
That's a really great observation. And what's fascinating is how this tension itself can lead to positive change. By wrestling with these questions, by engaging in respectful dialogue, and by challenging those outdated norms, we have the potential to create a more just and equitable world for everyone.
I love that idea. So it's not about shying away from the difficult conversations, but embracing them, seeing them as these opportunities for growth and progress.
Yeah, I like that.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question to ponder. Okay, how much of what we perceive as Islamic is actually rooted in cultural traditions or interpretations that may have veered away from the core principles of the faith over time? It's definitely something to keep in mind as we continue to explore this complex and fascinating topic. All right, welcome back to our deep dive on the Islamic view of families. We've covered a lot, haven't we? We talked about the core principles, the historical context, and even some of the challenges and debates that, surround this whole topic. But now I want to unpack that question I left you with at the end of the last part. Remember, how much of what we perceive as quote-unquote Islamic might actually be more rooted in cultural traditions that have evolved over time?
It's a big one, isn't it? It really forces us to look deeper, to question our assumptions about what we think we know.
Right, and the sources we've been looking at, they really highlight how some practices we might associate with Islam, well, they could actually stem from, tribal customs or patriarchal interpretations, even just cultural norms that over centuries have become kind of intertwined with the religion itself.
It's almost like these layers have built up, Makes it hard to see that original foundation clearly.
Exactly. So how do we start to peel back those layers? Where do we even begin?
Well, historical context is super important. It can really shed some light. Let's take polygamy as an example. It's permitted in Islam, right? But only under certain conditions. But the thing is, polygamy was already a common practice way back in pre-Islamic Arabia. So that makes you think, to what extent did Islam actually regulate an existing practice rather than introduce a brand new one? These are the types of questions we need to be asking.
That makes total sense. It's like trying to understand a modern law without knowing, the historical circumstances that led to it. It's all about that context. But this brings up another point, didn't it? I mean, thinking about the power dynamics involved, not just between men and women, but even within Islamic thought itself. Who gets to decide what's considered authentically Islamic? Whose voices are heard and whose voices end up being silenced in that process?
You've hit on something really important there. And what's interesting is our sources actually reveal a pretty diverse range of viewpoints within Islamic scholarship itself. You have different schools of thought, offering different interpretations on all those key concepts like marriage, divorce, inheritance, and women's roles in society. It's not a monolithic picture, not by any means.
I see. Yeah, so it's more like a vibrant tapestry with all these different opinions and perspectives. They're all drawing inspiration from the same core texts, but arriving at different conclusions.
Precisely. And that's why seeking out diverse voices is so crucial. Engage with scholarship from different schools of thought, think about those different cultural contexts, and most importantly, listen to the lived experiences of Muslim women themselves. Their perspectives are absolutely essential to truly grasping the complexities of this whole topic.
So it's about coming to this conversation not with these preconceived notions, but with a real curiosity, a desire to learn from those different perspectives you mentioned.
I think that's a fantastic takeaway, yeah. And connecting it back to you, the listener, it encourages us to be more critical consumers of information in general, to question assumptions, recognize that even within one faith tradition, you can have a vast range of interpretations and practices.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. From the historical context to those modern-day challenges, from legal rights to the diverse ways Islamic teachings are interpreted. It's been quite a journey. So as we wrap up, what key message would you want our listeners to take away from all this?
This is a big one, but I'd say the relationship between faith and gender roles, it's constantly evolving. It's shaped by so many factors like historical context, cultural influences, and those ongoing interpretations within religious traditions themselves. By approaching these topics with an open mind, with a willingness to challenge our own biases, and that commitment to amplifying diverse voices, well, that's how we can actually foster more nuanced and informed understanding of these complex issues.
Wow, that's powerful. And it reminds us that learning is a journey. It's not a destination. There's always more to discover, more perspectives to consider, and more to learn. I think that's a great place to leave it. We've definitely given everyone a lot to ponder. And remember, real knowledge isn't just about gathering facts, but it's about truly seeking to understand. So keep exploring, keep those questions coming, and as always, stay curious.